The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one very important thing. This phrase, attributed to an ancient Hellenic poet Archilochus, comes up in culture every once in a while. Whatever Archilochus, if there ever were such a person, meant by saying it, it does ring true to us. Isaiah Berlin even wrote a very popular essay titled The Hedgehog and the Fox, where he attempted to classify great writers and thinkers into foxes and hedgehogs. But we shouldn't care about this too much. We are concerned with practical strategic application. What we usually mean by fox in strategy is someone who is great at perception and analysis, someone who sees many opportunities as well as hindrances to his end, someone flexible and adaptable. If we think of a famous fox military leader, the desert fox Erwin Rommel, indeed his profile matches that of a perceptive and analytical man rather than that of a great dreamer with a grand vision fixated on one goal. That would be a hedgehog. I need to preface here that this classification is not an absolutist one. It outlines an apparent division in types of thinking and operating. The only reason we are talking about it at all is because it is useful, so please do not make it into something it isn't. With that out of the way, a more recent writer whom I suggest you take a look at, that being John Lewis Gladys, in his book on grand strategy writes a whole chapter where he speaks of Xerxes' invasion of Greece. Xerxes really wanted to conquer Greece. Greece, or Ellada, at this point in history existed as a land where Hellenic culture was present, a land organized of independent polities who competed and cooperated among each other without political unity, but with a sense of cultural and even civilizational unity. They did unify somewhat when Xerxes' predecessors conquered Lydia and other Hellenic lands. Persia, of which Xerxes was a ruler, was governed in a more centralized fashion. In other words, Xerxes had a huge army. Herodotus speaks of millions, later historians doubt these numbers and speak of hundreds of thousands instead. Either way, this was a lot of manpower. Xerxes had a lot of motivation to conquer Hellenic lands, and he even spoke of all European landmass. He really thought of conquering Europe, this absolute madman. I can't help but smile when I think of these Persian armies wandering up to Verdun or Schwarzwald. What kind of a surprise would he get there? Anyways, the fact that he thought of it just goes to demonstrate his ambition, which was plentiful. He was, in other words, a hedgehog. He wanted to conquer, he wanted to rule over a great many peoples, and he did not care for hindrances. He thought Greeks would not be able to put a resistance to him. That is how many forces he brought with him. So, just before crossing the sea to what were Hellenic lands, he consulted Artabanus, who was his uncle and advisor. Artabanus said that invading Greece was a bad idea, not only because Artabanus thought that Hellenes would in fact resist, but also he knew of the most important aspect of warfare that often gets neglected by many conquerors: supplying the army. Logistics, bad weather, wild animals. Mind you, in that historical time, there were wild lions roaming around in what is now Greece. Also, Persia was a land power, perhaps the strongest land power at the time, but Athens, for instance, was a sea power. Athens had not reached its peak at this point yet, and Xerxes had 3 times as many ships as Athenians, Spartans and Corinthians combined. Despite that, Persian naval warfare was still lacking. Xerxes' ships were mainly manned by peoples already conquered by Persia, like Egyptians and Lydians, which means that they probably weren't the most motivated fighters. These concerns, and many others, were raised before Xerxes by his advisor Artabanus. This betrays a fox type of thinker in Artabanus. He is perceptive and he sizes the end to the means. He doesn't have the ambition like Xerxes has. For him, invading Greece is simply not worth it. It doesn't mean that it is better to be a strategic fox. History remembers Xerxes for great many things. While Artabanus, after this episode, disappears from history, he goes back to Persian heartland to do administrative work, and as noble as it might be, history rarely remembers bureaucrats. Xerxes, however, is too much of a hedgehog. We know what happened next. He invaded Greece, which consolidated Hellenic polities, brought them into union. They organized an evacuation of citizenry and always were one step ahead of Persian army. Leonidas and his men died at Thermopylae, each Spartan selling their life for many Persian lives. This showed Xerxes' army that Hellenes would resist forcefully and viciously. That would not be an easy ride for Persians. Xerxes was unable to turn back because he made certain ritual gestures before the war that essentially locked him into this path. He had an end, but he did not have means to achieve it. He had an ambition, but it was impossible to fulfill it. He did not want to see objective reality. He was too much of a hedgehog in terms of strategy. His eventual defeat consolidated Greece by giving it a unifying cause and made Persia a second-class power. So, is it better to be a fox or a hedgehog? In this scenario, both ways of thinking and operating seem less than ideal. You can see that a concentrated energy of a hedgehog fails him because of a narrowness of his worldview, but you also see that a fox is bound to stay somewhat uninspired. In other words, Do you want to be too short-sighted to seize and open an opportunity? Or so far-sighted you will not notice an obvious boulder in your path and stumble and break your face bloody with a lot of embarrassment? Probably you won't neither. This video specifically featured negative examples. There is much to be said about positive examples as well, but the negative examples stick to memory better. By the way, if I mixed something up historically, do not spurg out, I don't care. This period in history is fuzzy enough to be considered mythical. As a conclusion, it is very useful strategically to distinguish between the way of the fox and the way of the hedgehog. It pays well to recognize them in others and run whatever strategic plans you have with yourself using these frameworks. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing here and elsewhere. This was Strategos. Au revoir.